Rehman Dacoit, Miles Carter, and Victor Haines, three men whose lives collided in a story of betrayal, obsession, and cold-blooded revenge. One was a fugitive hiding from his violent past, one was a detective chasing the truth, and one was a master of precision who turned vengeance into a meticulously executed nightmare. What happened that night in an abandoned warehouse would shock the world and leave a trail of questions that may never be answered. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. The morning began with heavy fog hanging low over the industrial edge of the town, a place rarely visited unless someone had business with rusted buildings and forgotten roads. An abandoned meat processing warehouse stood at the far end, its walls stained by decades of neglect. When a maintenance worker arrived to check a broken power line nearby, he noticed the warehouse door slightly open. That alone felt wrong. The building had been sealed for years. Inside, the smell hit first, sharp and metallic, mixed with rot. Police were called within minutes. Officers entered carefully, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The floor was covered in dried marks that told a violent story without words. At the center of the room lay a body placed with disturbing care. The man was later identified as Rehman Dacoit. His clothes were clean, almost untouched, which made the injuries stand out even more. The wounds were deep and exact, not random or rushed. Each cut looked planned, as if the person responsible had taken their time and knew exactly where to strike. There was no sign of a fight, no broken objects, no defensive injuries. The silence of the scene felt intentional. The condition of the body disturbed even the most experienced investigators. This was not a crime driven by panic or emotion. It was controlled. The tools used were never found, but the nature of the wounds suggested sharp instruments designed for precision. The placement of the body suggested respect or purpose, not fear. It was clear that the killer did not want the body hidden forever. It was meant to be found. Outside the warehouse, there were no footprints, no tire marks, and no nearby cameras working. The area had been chosen carefully. The fog had erased what little chance there was of witnesses. Even the timing seemed calculated. The body had been left only hours before discovery, enough time for the message to remain fresh, but not enough for evidence to decay completely. As investigators began building a profile, Rehman's background slowly came into focus. He was not listed as missing. No one had reported him absent. His phone was turned off, and his apartment showed no signs of disturbance. It was as if he had walked into the warehouse willingly. That detail raised the first major concern. Whoever killed him was someone he trusted or someone he did not see as a threat. The autopsy later confirmed what officers already suspected. Death was not quick, but it was deliberate. Pain was not the goal. Control was. The method told a story of patience and deep intention. This was not a random act of violence in a forgotten building. This was the final chapter of something that had started long before this morning, long before Rehman Dacoit ever came to America. By the time the sun burned away the fog, one truth had already settled among the investigators. This was not just a murder. It was a carefully written ending, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it was unforgettable. Rehman Dacoit did not arrive in the United States as an innocent man searching for a new beginning. He arrived carrying a past that followed him quietly, like a shadow that never fully disappeared. Years earlier, his name had been whispered in police stations and village streets back home. He was linked to land seizures, violent enforcement, and sudden disappearances that were never officially solved. Evidence against him had always been strong but never complete. Witnesses changed their stories. Files went missing. Fear did the rest. When pressure grew too intense, Rehman vanished from public view and reappeared overseas with legal documents that raised no suspicion. In America, Rehman lived carefully. He chose modest neighborhoods and avoided attention. He worked long hours as a delivery contractor, blending into a workforce filled with people who asked no questions. His neighbors barely knew him beyond a polite nod. He paid rent on time, kept his apartment clean, and never caused trouble. To most people around him, he was invisible. That invisibility was intentional. Behind this quiet life, Rehman remained cautious and calculating. He used prepaid phones that were replaced often. His online presence was almost non-existent. Financial records later showed that he moved money through multiple accounts, sending large amounts abroad under different names. These transfers were regular and structured, suggesting obligation rather than generosity. Investigators believed he was maintaining old ties, possibly funding operations or protecting himself from unfinished business. What made Rehman difficult to understand was the contrast between his past and present. There were no signs of reckless behavior. He did not drink heavily. He did not socialize much. He followed routines with discipline. Every morning started at the same time. Every evening ended the same way. This level of control suggested a man who had survived by staying alert and prepared. He knew how quickly power could disappear. Despite his careful lifestyle, small cracks had begun to appear in the months before his death. Surveillance records showed that he had been visiting unfamiliar areas late at night. He had also accessed legal services connected to international cases, something he had avoided for years. These actions hinted at fear or pressure. It appeared that someone or something had forced him out of hiding. Investigators also uncovered that Rehman had changed his name more than once since arriving in the country. Each change was legal, supported by paperwork, but the frequency raised concern. It showed a pattern of running, not settling. He was not building a future. He was delaying an ending. Those who had crossed Rehman in the past often paid a heavy price. Families were broken, livelihoods were destroyed. Some people were never seen again. While he had escaped legal punishment, the damage he caused remained alive in memory. The absence of justice did not mean forgiveness. It only meant waiting. By the time authorities fully understood who Rehman Dacoit truly was, he was already dead. The quiet man found in the warehouse was not a victim chosen at random. He was a man whose past had finally reached him, crossing borders and years without making a sound. His death did not begin a story. It revealed one that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Miles Carter had seen gruesome crime scenes before. But the case of Rehman Dacoit was unlike anything he had encountered. As a senior crime analyst, he relied on patterns, details others overlooked, and an instinct honed by years of studying human behavior. From the first report, something about the scene didn't add up. The warehouse where Rehman's body was found was meticulously cleaned, except for the area immediately surrounding him. The cuts on the body were not haphazard. Each wound followed a precise path, almost surgical in nature. Carter immediately understood that this was not the work of an impulsive criminal. This was deliberate, practiced, and personal. The autopsy report confirmed his suspicions. The way the muscles and tendons were severed suggested someone who had a deep knowledge of anatomy or had extensive experience handling meat. The angles of the cuts were consistent with someone who had worked in environments where precision was necessary. Carter knew immediately that the killer had not acted out of anger or hate. The act was controlled, calm, and exact. Someone had taken time to plan this, to prepare, and to execute it without hesitation. This was a calculated act, not a crime of passion. Carter began his investigation by reconstructing Rehman's last known movements. He discovered that Rehman had been careful in his daily routines, sticking to familiar routes and avoiding unnecessary attention. Yet, on the day of his death, he had traveled to a part of town he rarely visited. CCTV footage from surrounding streets showed him walking with purpose, carrying nothing that could identify him, yet also showing no signs of awareness of danger. This indicated two possibilities. Either Rehman trusted someone, or he did not recognize the threat until it was too late. As Carter reviewed the scene photos and forensic reports, he noticed details that others might have missed. Small splatters, minor marks on the floor, even the placement of Rehman's body suggested an intention to send a message. The killer wanted the body to be found, but also wanted it to be interpreted in a specific way. It was a statement, but one that required insight into Rehman's life, his habits, and his history. Carter realized this was someone who had studied him closely, someone who knew him beyond the surface. Further investigation revealed that the warehouse itself had been carefully chosen. It was abandoned, yet accessible, far from prying eyes. The killer had selected a location that offered complete control over the environment, minimizing risk while maximizing impact. This choice reinforced Carter's belief that this was personal. It was not a random act of violence. Someone had tracked Rehman's routines, anticipated his movements, and orchestrated the final moment with precision. The realization weighed heavily on Carter. Whoever had killed Rehman had planned it for months, perhaps even years. It was methodical, patient, and chilling. The killer was not driven by fear, emotion, or impulsiveness. They were driven by calculation, experience, and a desire for absolute control. Carter knew that understanding this mindset would be crucial to solving the case. Every detail mattered, and overlooking even the smallest clue could allow the killer to remain free. For Miles Carter, this was more than a case. It was a puzzle of human intent, one that demanded patience, insight, and unyielding focus. The question remained, who had the skill, the patience, and the motive to commit such a brutal act? Early in the investigation, police and media alike were quick to draw conclusions. The location of the murder, a deserted meat processing warehouse, combined with the precise, butcher-like wounds, immediately suggested ties to organized crime. Stories began circulating about gangs involved in illegal slaughterhouses, people who operated in the shadows and took extreme measures to protect their operations. Detectives initially focused on local suspects who fit this profile, men with criminal records, known for violent behavior, and familiar with weapons or knives. At first glance, the pieces seemed to fit, and the narrative was almost ready-made. News outlets painted Rehman Dacoit's death as a revenge killing gone wrong, tied to criminal rivalries and dark, hidden trades. Several suspects were quickly brought in for questioning. They had histories with violence and arrests for possession of illegal knives and firearms. Some had been seen near the warehouse in previous months. Investigators hoped their confessions, or at least their timelines, would connect them to the crime. Early evidence seemed to reinforce the theory. Minor blood traces found near one suspect's residence, unverified rumors of disputes, and vague witness reports of shadowy figures moving in the industrial district. Public opinion began to lean toward a simple explanation. This was gang violence, nothing more. But Miles Carter, the lead analyst, noticed inconsistencies immediately. The suspects had no verifiable connection to Rehman's past. They had never met him, had no known motive, and had been accounted for elsewhere at the time of the murder. None of the weapons linked to them could have caused the precise cuts observed in the autopsy. The gang theory, while convenient, fell apart under careful scrutiny. The more Carter examined the evidence, the more it seemed that the investigation was being steered in the wrong direction, deliberately or not. The warehouse itself offered further contradictions. Security footage from nearby streets showed no gang activity in the hours leading up to the murder. The killer had entered and exited with minimal disturbance, leaving no trace of the chaos typically associated with gang confrontations. Even the method of murder, the meticulous, almost surgical dismemberment, was unlike anything seen in street-level criminal activity. It was methodical, almost professional. Carter began to suspect that someone had intentionally left evidence pointing toward gangs to mislead investigators. Interviews with locals revealed a strange pattern. People who lived or worked near the warehouse claimed to have seen unusual vehicles in the area, ones not linked to any known gang. A few mentioned seeing a man in clean, non-threatening clothing carrying a large case, disappearing before anyone could approach. This suggested that the killer had carefully controlled the scene and public perception. It was becoming clear that Rehman's murder was not simply about revenge or intimidation. By the end of the fourth week, Carter concluded that the so-called false trail was sophisticated. The killers had anticipated that investigators would look for common criminal elements, exploiting assumptions to cover their true identities. The initial focus on gangs had wasted valuable time and almost obscured the real story. Whoever had killed Rehman Dacoit had not only executed a precise murder, but had also orchestrated a misleading narrative. Manipulating public perception and the investigation itself, Carter realized that uncovering the truth would require looking beyond obvious suspects, beyond street-level violence, into a deeper, more calculated web of connections. The case was no longer just about a brutal death. It was about unraveling a story that someone had worked hard to bury under layers of deception. Miles Carter knew that to solve the murder of Rehman Dacoit, he had to look beyond obvious suspects. The initial gang theory had fallen apart, and the careful precision of the crime suggested a killer with knowledge, patience, and a personal motive. Financial records offered the next clue. Carter discovered that in the months leading up to his death, Rehman had made several large transfers to a US-based legal consulting firm. On the surface, it appeared to be legitimate business. Rehman was paying for services to maintain his legal status and protect assets overseas. But as Carter dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. The consulting firm had multiple layers of ownership and shell companies. The true identities of its partners were hidden behind legal paperwork, making it difficult to track their connections. Carter spent hours tracing ownership records, phone logs, and tax filings. Eventually, one name stood out: a silent partner who had suffered personal loss years earlier in a case connected to Rehman's activities overseas. This individual had lost family members to a violent dispute in Rehman's home country, a tragedy that had been quietly dismissed by authorities. Carter realized that this person had reason for deep resentment, one that could easily translate into revenge. What made the connection even more chilling was how carefully it had been hidden. Rehman likely did not suspect the link. The payments to the legal firm may have been his last attempt to shield himself from legal consequences, completely unaware that he was indirectly funding the very person plotting against him. Carter began mapping a timeline. Rehman had recently accessed legal consultations, increased his transfers, and even changed routines, all around the same time the killer was preparing. It was as if the plan had been timed to wait for the perfect moment. Carter also found evidence that suggested surveillance. Security camera footage from various streets near Rehman's apartment showed a recurring figure, someone observing him for weeks without being noticed. The person was careful, never approaching directly, and often dressed in ways that blended into the environment. This level of patience was rare, even among professional criminals. Carter recognized a pattern of methodical observation, a step-by-step plan to ensure success. Further investigation into the legal firm revealed more than just financial connections. There were encrypted emails, deleted documents, and records of meetings with people who had links to both the US and Rehman's home country. Carter theorized that the murder was not an isolated act of personal vengeance, but part of a larger operation that had been in the making for years. It involved careful planning, extensive resources, and a knowledge of Rehman's life that few people could have possessed. By now it was clear that the warehouse murder was only the final act. The killer had chosen the location for visibility, for symbolism, and to ensure that Rehman's final movements were controlled. The financial trails, surveillance, and hidden connections revealed a sophisticated plan executed by someone who was patient, methodical, and deeply personal in their motives. Carter understood that the death of Rehman Dacoit was not just revenge. It was a calculated, multi-layered operation, crafted with knowledge of law, human behavior, and the vulnerabilities of a man who thought he had escaped his past. The layers of deception were deliberate, and each one led back to someone who had waited years for this moment, letting time itself become part of the weapon. Carter's investigation took a sharp turn when the forensic reports were cross-referenced with employment records in the area surrounding the warehouse. The precision of the cuts on Rehman Dacoit's body suggested someone who knew exactly how to handle knives and tools, someone who had experience not just in violence, but in control, measurement, and anatomy. The type of expertise required was rare, and Carter suspected the killer was trained in a professional environment where such skills were routine. This led him to examine former slaughterhouses, meat processing plants, and butchery operations within a 50-mile radius. The breakthrough came when he discovered the employment history of a man named Victor Haines, a former supervisor at a large meat processing facility that had shut down abruptly a few weeks before the murder. Victor had a history of working with precision tools and maintaining strict protocols. His expertise aligned perfectly with the butcher-like wounds found on Rehman's body. Carter delved deeper and found that Victor had resigned under suspicious circumstances. He had been involved in legal disputes with former colleagues, and there were rumors of personal grievances against a client whose identity remained vague. When Carter traced Victor's movements, he found that he had been in the area around the warehouse in the weeks before the murder. Surveillance footage, though grainy, showed a figure resembling him carrying a large, unmarked case, entering industrial zones during unusual hours. It was consistent with someone preparing for a calculated task rather than acting impulsively. Victor's knowledge of the warehouse's layout, combined with the evidence of careful planning, suggested that he had chosen the location for both accessibility and control. The most startling discovery came when Carter investigated Victor's past overseas. Decades earlier, Victor had testified in a court case that involved Rehman. Though the case was dismissed after witnesses mysteriously disappeared, Victor had never forgotten the humiliation and danger that had resulted from Rehman's influence. He had left the country, reinvented himself professionally, and seemingly moved on. But the timing and precision of Rehman's murder suggested that Victor had been waiting, observing, and preparing for years. The act was personal, precise, and patient, a signature of someone who had allowed resentment to fester until the moment was perfect. Carter also noted subtle signs that Victor was not acting entirely alone. Certain forensic evidence, such as the method of transporting materials and the strategic removal of tools, suggested additional hands. The warehouse had been cleared of fingerprints, and nothing in Victor's known history explained the level of sophistication in the scene. It was as if Victor had planned the murder, but relied on accomplices to execute parts of it. Every detail now fit together like pieces of a dark puzzle. The warehouse, the method of killing, Victor's expertise, and his history with Rehman all pointed to a meticulously planned act of revenge. The crime was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a carefully orchestrated operation, executed with precision and patience. Carter realized that uncovering Victor's role was only the beginning. Behind the layers of careful planning lay a network of intention, secrecy, and long-held grudges, each element perfectly aligned to ensure that Rehman Dacoit's death was both brutal and unforgettable. The investigation was no longer about street-level violence. It was about understanding the mind of a killer who had merged skill, patience, and personal vendetta into one final, chilling act. Each piece of evidence revealed a story of time, method, and cold calculation, a story Carter knew would haunt him long after the case files were closed. The investigation had reached a critical point. Every lead Miles Carter followed pointed toward Victor Haines, yet the puzzle was far from complete. Despite the mounting evidence linking Victor to Rehman Dacoit's murder, there was an unnerving gap. Victor had vanished. Days turned into weeks, and every attempt to trace him ended in dead ends. Phone numbers were disconnected, relatives and acquaintances provided no useful information, and surveillance footage showed no new sightings. The disappearance itself suggested premeditation. Victor had planned contingencies, as though he anticipated being pursued. Then came the shocking discovery. Victor Haines' body was found in a secluded cabin miles outside the city, an apparent suicide. At first glance, it seemed straightforward. A man cornered by his own actions, unable to face consequences, had chosen to end his life. But Carter, trained to notice inconsistencies, immediately recognized anomalies. There were no fingerprints on the firearm found nearby, no note, no evidence of hesitation or struggle. The body's position and surrounding objects appeared staged, deliberately placed to convey a narrative. It felt as though someone had made sure Victor's death told a specific story, a story meant to close a chapter while leaving questions unanswered. The more Carter analyzed the scene, the more it became clear that Victor was not acting entirely alone in Rehman's murder. There were subtle signs of outside involvement, traces of additional cleaning agents at the warehouse, movements that indicated multiple sets of hands, and logistical planning that exceeded what a single individual could manage. Victor may have been the executioner, the one with the skill and personal motive, but the operation had been larger, orchestrated to perfection by others operating in the shadows. Financial records hinted at this hidden network. Unusual transfers were traced to shell accounts, many linked to professionals in law, logistics, and security, people who could manipulate evidence, provide access, and ensure secrecy. It suggested that Rehman's murder had been part of a larger plan, designed not only to exact revenge, but to erase any trace of accountability. Each participant had a defined role, operating with discipline and secrecy, all converging on a single goal. The brutality of the murder was deliberate, but so too was its invisibility until discovery. Carter realized that Rehman's death was the final act of a carefully plotted story written over years. Victor had executed the plan, but the mastermind, the one who orchestrated everything from afar, remained unknown. The killer's precision, patience, and ability to control the narrative suggested someone highly intelligent, familiar with human behavior, and motivated by more than simple vengeance. Every choice in the operation, from timing to location, was calculated to convey a chilling message: control, patience, and inevitability. By the time the investigation concluded, Miles Carter had pieced together most of the mechanics behind Rehman's murder, but the truth would never fully surface. The surviving network remained hidden, their identities protected by layers of secrecy and manipulation. Victor's suicide served as both a conclusion and a misdirection, a final act that masked the wider conspiracy. In the end, the murder of Rehman Dacoit was not just an execution of revenge. It was a demonstration of control, patience, and meticulous orchestration. It was a lesson in how calculated brutality could be hidden beneath the appearance of chaos, leaving only fragments for investigators to reconstruct, and a chilling reminder that some acts of vengeance extend far beyond the hands that deliver the final blow. The official files declared the case closed, but Miles Carter knew the truth was far more complicated. Rehman Dacoit's death had been recorded as the result of personal vendetta, and Victor Haines' apparent suicide seemed to tie up the narrative neatly. Yet the evidence told a different story, one of a multi-layered plan executed with surgical precision, patience, and unseen collaborators. Carter understood that the murder had not been a single act of vengeance. It was a carefully orchestrated conclusion to years of hidden grudges and covert operations. The brutality inflicted on Rehman's body was deliberate, but it was not about rage. Each cut, each placement of the corpse, each element of the scene conveyed control, awareness, and patience. The killer had known Rehman's habits, his routines, and his vulnerabilities, and had used that knowledge to manipulate the final act. What had appeared to be chaos was, in fact, an engineered display of precision. Carter realized that the murder was a message, one intended to demonstrate dominance, skill, and finality, not to satisfy immediate anger. Financial trails, hidden partnerships, and shell accounts hinted at a wider network of people who had ensured that the plan unfolded without interference. The operation had been executed like a machine. Every participant had a defined role, every action premeditated. Even the false trail pointing toward gangs had been deliberate, designed to mislead authorities and delay discovery of the real motive. By the time investigators followed the evidence to Victor Haines, the stage had already been set for the appearance of closure. Carter reflected on the human cost behind the methodical cruelty. Rehman had been a man with a violent past, responsible for pain and suffering, yet his death was not a random act of justice. It was an engineered lesson in power and patience. The killers, whoever remained hidden, had calculated years of observation, resources, and timing to create a moment that would echo beyond Rehman's death. The act had demanded cold patience, waiting for him to make predictable choices and ensuring that no error could derail the plan. It was vengeance, yes, but it was also artistry in violence, a horrifying testament to human calculation. The question of why no one else had been caught haunted Carter. Victor's death had removed the most visible executor, but the network that had orchestrated the crime remained concealed. Some were likely professionals with resources and knowledge to cover their tracks. Others may have operated with personal motives as deeply buried as Victor's own grudge. Carter knew that while the investigation had closed officially, the full truth would never reach the public. There were too many moving parts, too many hidden hands, and too much patience invested in ensuring silence. In the end, the story of Rehman Dacoit's death became a cautionary tale not just of vengeance, but of human obsession and calculated cruelty. It reminded Carter, and anyone who studied the files, that some crimes are designed to leave more questions than answers, more fear than closure. Rehman's past had caught up with him, but not in a way anyone could have predicted. It had arrived like a shadow, silent and inevitable, shaped by skill, precision, and patience. Carter filed his final report with a sense of unease. The files could show a closed case, but he knew the truth. Rehman Dacoit's death was never just a murder. It was a calculated statement, a lesson in control, and a grim reminder that some acts of revenge are far larger than the individuals who carry them out. Some truths, he realized, are never meant to be fully revealed. They exist in the spaces between evidence, in the patterns left behind, and in the chilling silence of meticulous human calculation.